In today's video, we explore how to achieve a picture-perfect look with your knits, acknowledging that while perfection is a myth, excellent presentation is achievable. So if that sounds like just your cup of tea, get cozy and let's dive in. Hello, and welcome to the Wool Needles Hands Midweek Ramble. My name is Taylor, and I will be your host. For today's video, I wanted to explore a topic that has come up a lot, kind of over the course of time that I have been producing YouTube videos, but also something that came up in the comment section of my last midweek ramble where I talked about perfectionism. And that is the idea of what we see presented to us and curated for us by folks on social media or on YouTube or wherever, displaying their hand knits in a way that would make you think or that conveys the idea of perfection. Now, when it comes to your knits, sometimes when we see these images on social media, we tend to look at that and think, well, that's not the way my sweater came out, or my knits don't look just like that. So for today, I want to tell you there are some tricks, tips that you can take away and use to give your knits a picture-perfect look, kind of like what you're seeing in those posts on social media, without actually having to be perfect. Because number one, we're not perfect. Number two, we shouldn't strive for perfection. And number three, perfection is boring. So let's go ahead and dive into some tips and tricks and things to consider if you want to get the most picture perfect look and presentation of your hand knits while acknowledging the fact that you aren't perfect. I think while we're at it, I should acknowledge the fact that there's things on my sweater here that I knit myself that make it not perfect, but we move on. I will talk about this towards the end of the video. The things I'm sharing with you today are not only going to give the look of, I'm going to use the word perfection like with air quotes almost every time I say it today, but give the look of perfection in a photograph. It can also lend that same clean finished look in person if somebody is there appreciating your work in person. We need to acknowledge some key elements that contribute to a more sloppy or overall inconsistent look to your knits. And I have 5 key things I want to share with you today. The first one is inconsistent tension. This is, in my opinion, the biggest contributing factor to the sloppy look of knits. Now, that isn't to say there aren't other really major contributing factors like poor fit, and that comes down to gauge and knitting the right size and all of that. But the one thing that you have in your control, believe it or not, that can really help provide a more consistent and perfect look to your knits is getting your tension under control and making sure it's consistent. Now, I'm going to provide some links down below in the description box here so that you can navigate away and find some helpful tips and tricks and look at some tutorials on how to get the most consistent tension. But here are some quick ideas that can get that ball rolling. The first thing is practice consistently. The more consistent you knit, the more you're going to get a handle on the tension that works for you and the rhythm that works for you. That doesn't mean pick up a knit for 4 hours one day out of the week. That means knit a little bit every single day. Even if you're only knitting 10 or 15 minutes a day, make sure you're doing it every day. I have gotten on the kick of doing 20 minutes of yoga every day, and I'm not gloating here, and I'm not saying everybody should be doing this, but I will say that I do a lot better with my yoga. I'm much more flexible, I'm stronger if I'm doing it in small chunks throughout the week, as opposed to trying to slam in 3 45-minute yoga sessions every week, which really isn't very feasible. 20 minutes a day, I can do 10 to 15 minutes of really great uninterrupted and focused knitting time where you can really give some time to the rhythm and cadence of your stitches is going to help build consistency. Next one here is how you handle your yarn when you're knitting. Now, I'm going to pop in a little bit of a video, and I'll link to the whole video down below in the description box, showing you the way that I knit. My knitting technique is my knitting technique. It's kind of a mix between throwing and flicking. But one thing that's really important about the way that I knit is how I hold the yarn in my hands. Some people choose to wrap the yarn around their pinky and their middle finger, and then finally over their index finger that they then wrap around the needle if you are an English style knitter. Other people hold the yarn in their left hand if they are a continental style knitter, and then they might have the yarn tensioned across 2 or 3 additional fingers, depending on what works best for them. It's really important to figure out which method of holding your yarn and your needles works for you and to stick to it. Make that the only way that you knit, and in the very least, make it the only way you knit within one project. If you want to play around knitting continental or flicking or throwing, don't change techniques in the middle of a project because it is sure to change the consistency of your tension. One little thing I want to mention here, and I feel when it comes to maintaining tension, this is really important. You want to make sure that when you're knitting, the tips of your knitting needles never come more than 1 inch away from one another. And even an inch is generous. You want to make sure you keep the tips of your needles close together. When you're pulling the yarn around the needle, flicking the yarn around the needle, whatever you're doing, keep the tips of your needles close together. If you start pulling them away like this, you're starting to loosen the stitches. And also, it's really hard to keep consistent how far away you're pulling those needles if you tend to pull them beyond 1 inch. Sometimes you'll pull it 1.5 inches. Sometimes you'll stretch it to 2 inches. Sometimes you won't pull it even to 1 inch. And all of that leads to inconsistent stitches. Keep them close together. You almost want it to be like there's a magnet in each tip of the needles and they're wanting to stay close together. Another thing to remember, whatever yarn handling technique you use or knitting technique you use, whether it's continental or flicking or throwing, you want to make sure that your hands are moving as little as possible. You want small movements, consistent and concise and efficient movement of your hand. If you find that you're knitting and you're pulling this hand around to wrap your yarn, or you're having to drop the needle altogether to then position the yarn around your fingers and then to wrap it, you have lots of movement going on. It should be a very small amount of movement happening in your hand. There's very little big movement going on. Everything stays in this small little space in front of you. Your elbows aren't moving up and down like this. Everything is positioned right in front of you, and your movements are confined to your hands and your wrists. Now, this is why carpal tunnel is an issue, and you do have to be careful making sure you're taking breaks to stretch out your wrists. Small, consistent, and efficient movements are key. Anything bigger than that, anytime you're taking up more space in front of you to execute a stitch, you're going to have inconsistent stitches, and that's going to lead to an overall sloppy look with your fabric, especially with a fabric that consists of primarily stockinette stitch. Something else to consider are your needles. Make sure that you are using the needle that works for you. If you find that your stitches tend to be really loose when you're using metal or slippery needles, use something made of wood or bamboo. And the opposite is true if you find that your stitches are too tight with wood, bamboo, or a more sticky, tacky needle, move to something that allows your stitches to glide across the surface of the needle. And that will inevitably lead to an overall more consistent tension in your stitches. And definitely try to keep your hands relaxed. This is a tricky one, especially depending on what's going on around you, what's going on in your mind. We will be gripping the needles more tightly if we're stressed, more loosely if we're much more relaxed, or maybe we've had a couple glasses of wine. Who's to say? And I think that would probably be good advice. Maybe don't drink and knit at the same time because your tension's liable to just really loosen up after, a glass or two of wine. You want to make sure that whatever it is that you're doing, you keep your hands relaxed. I have a plan and kind of a video in progress right now where I share with you some hand yoga techniques that I really like to do. It's a real super hippy dippy granola video that's coming down the pipe later in the summer, but it's very important to employ hand stretches and to keep your hands relaxed. Stop knitting every once in a while. Let your hands rest. You would be amazed, mind blown, if you knew how many muscles you were using just to knit stockinette stitch. It really is truly mind-boggling. Now, all of that has to do with evening out your tension. But another really common flaw, if you will, that contributes to an overall sloppy look of your knits, and I hate to use the term sloppy, so please take that with a grain of salt. I think we all know what I'm talking about here, but that's poor finishing techniques. Now, your finishing techniques are all the things that you do when you're finished knitting. That would be binding off, weaving in your ends, whip stitching your seams together, creating pom-poms or tassels to attach to your knits, adding buttons. All of these things are those last little cherries on top that give your piece a more professional, put together, and finished look. If you rush through those things, and take it from me, I know what it feels like to rush through those things. We've all been there, where we kind of have finished all of the work for a project only to rush through the finishes, and then we feel underwhelmed or just not satisfied with the overall look. And that's because we didn't give the necessary time to the finishing techniques. Take time to do those things right. I don't love the idea of seaming up a garment, and I avoid those projects because I don't feel like I am ready to devote the time that it takes for certain projects to seam it up correctly. I am afraid, and I know that there will be a day coming when I have to confront that fear and just do it and take the time necessary to do it right. I'm aware of that because I know that if I don't do it right, it's really going to create a very sloppy garment, and I don't want that. So I'm here to tell you, take the time to finish everything nicely. You can bake an absolutely delicious birthday cake and then cover it with fondant and all kinds of decorations quickly and hastily and have it look like a complete mess, and nobody's going to want to take a bite of it, and you're definitely not going to be proud of it. It's the same with your knitting. Make sure your finishing is up to snuff, and that is where you should be devoting a lot of that really patient time and care to make everything look nice. I've provided a link down below to my favorite place to go for all things finishing techniques, and that is the Pearl Soho Finishing Techniques Archive. Their presentation is amazing all the time, and if you go here, you have all of the major finishing techniques right there for you with written and video tutorials. Brooklyn Tweed also has a really great archive for that as well. The next flaw that leads to somewhat sloppy knits and can also make or break whether or not something looks picture ready when it's finished is, you guessed it, inconsistent blocking. Blocking is the essential final step for any knitting project, save for maybe socks. Okay, I will go so far as to say you really don't need to block socks, but for most everything else, you need to block your knits. It's what takes something from, okay, that's a hat, to, wow, that is a beautiful hand knit hat that looks picture perfect and photo ready. You need to block your knits. Now, blocking knits is not just soaking something, wringing it out, and then flattening it out onto a table and leaving it. I mean, essentially, that's kind of what you're doing, but there's a little bit more to it than that. First, choose the right blocking method. The blocking method showed in the video is the wet block method. That's where you completely submerge the item in water, you let it soak, you wring out the additional water. There's ways that you can do this, and that's mentioned in the video there. And then you lay everything out, flatten everything out neatly, and you allow it to dry completely. Or if you're working with synthetic fibers or fibers that don't block well in the wet block scenario, you will steam block those using the steamer setting on your iron without the iron coming into contact with the fiber. Natural fibers, wool fibers, plant-based fibers, you're going to want to wet block those. Synthetic fibers, man-made fibers, and even some more heavy-duty cotton fibers, you can steam block those with much greater success. The next thing is that you're going to want to measure and shape out your garment accurately, but there is something to consider here. If you knit a garment to a particular size and you keep thinking in your mind, I will just go ahead and block it out to the appropriate size, if you're, say, something like a size and a half off, you are embarking on a treacherous journey. Do not rely on blocking to increase or decrease anything more than maybe a half of a size in your project, because if you think that's going to happen, chances are you are going to underblock, meaning that you're going to have to scrunch up the project to achieve a smaller size, which really, honestly, I don't think anybody ever does that because it never works. Or you are going to overstretch and throw the garment out of shape by trying to stretch it out to the following size above, or even 2 sizes above what you actually knit. This is never a good idea. I always kind of think what you should do is lay your garment down, flatten everything out, neaten up the edges, straighten everything out, and let it go. Don't stretch it to the required dimensions. Just move it to the required dimensions. And if you have to do anything other than just moving everything to proportion, then I feel like you're over blocking it and over stretching it. And what's going to happen is you will have misaligned sides, things will be off center, and everything will look overall kind of wonky. So don't force your blocking and don't force the size out of your garment. You just kind of have to go with it and block it to the size that you knit. That is the best advice I could give when it comes to getting the best look out of your blocked garments. And really, really important here, and you really have to be patient, is to let things dry completely. If you move the garment and begin to kind of fold it and put it away or wear it or what have you before things are completely dry, everything is going to spring back to the shape it was before you blocked it, or at least a little bit, the stitches are going to tighten back up again. Give it a good squeeze in between your fingers, because if you just rub your hands over it like this, you can be deceived, because wool has a really great way of feeling dry even though it is quite wet. So give it a little gentle squeeze between your fingers and that will let you know if things are completely dry. The next thing that can lead to sloppy or not very well put together knits is not understanding your gauge going into your project. Again, this is one of those lecture-y type tidbits and pieces of advice, but you need to check your gauge. You need to understand how the fabric is going to look when you knit with the yarn, with the needles. It is so informative and enlightening before starting a project. So take your time to check your gauge as it states in every pattern. This is going to provide you with so much information and make you feel so much more confident about your knitting. And it's actually a really great way to kind of warm your hands up to whatever knitting pattern or whatever stitch pattern you're going to be using throughout the pattern for the most part. Some patterns will just ask you to knit stockinette stitch, but there are times where there is a particular stitch pattern you have to swatch with, and this kind of gives you that warm up. Something else that's liable to lead to sloppy looking knits or knits that just don't have that picture perfect appeal you're after is not choosing the correct yarn for the project. Now, if you plan on deviating from the yarn that's recommended by the designer, you really want to make sure that whatever yarn you're using to substitute the recommended yarn is suitable for the project that you are knitting. Wool yarn is different from plant-based fiber. Plant-based fiber and wool yarns are different and will behave differently in comparison to synthetic fibers. All of these things are going to contribute to the overall look, drape, and feel of your project. And if you're not choosing the right yarn for the project, you're going to have something that doesn't turn out the way you were expecting and doesn't have that picture perfect ready look. Now, I have a video where I share with you tips and tricks for substituting yarn, and in that video there's a lot of insight into which yarns work best with certain patterns and how to choose the right yarn for the job. I will link to that video down below, but this is really important when making sure that your finished piece looks picture perfect and photo ready. Now, you've finished a garment, all of your finishing techniques are in check, you've made sure that your tension is nice and even, everything is done, and you're ready to share it with the world. Now, this is where, when it comes to posting a photo of your finished project on social media, this is where you could really kind of tip the scales in your favor in terms of how picture perfect and photo ready your item is. And that isn't just your photography skills alone. The most important thing, you could be taking the photograph with a potato, and this is really the most important thing that you need to consider, and that is your lighting. The lighting has to be natural, indirect light. That means light that was produced by the beautiful sun in the sky, but not directly from the sun in the sky. That means that the light is coming in through the window, like the light that you see here. Everything here right now is natural light. I don't have any studio lights, and I love that. But the sun is not directly out my window. I can't see the sun in the sky. This is just natural light coming in here that is essentially shaded. You know that really lovely diffused light that you get on a somewhat cloudy day where we have high clouds? It's not really looming wet clouds, but like high clouds covering the sun, the light is diffused. That is the best light for photographing anything to put anywhere, whether it's social media or print it out and put it on your wall. It's the best lighting. So you want to strive for that kind of light. Now, you can't control the weather, and that's fine. And that's why it's really important that whatever natural light you choose, it is indirect light. You don't want sunshine, you just want light coming in from the windows. That is the biggest thing that you can possibly take away from this. Your photography and how you set up your photo, how you arrange the photo is really important to give that overall finished look. And sometimes that means there's lots of things going on in the picture, and sometimes it means that it's very simple and focused. That's how a lot of folks are getting those really picture perfect looks of their knits. And you know, it's as simple as something like taking a stack of hand knits like what you see here and holding it up to the camera, where all you see is just this cross section of folded up knitwear. You don't know what these knits look like on their own. You don't know what kinds of mistakes are hiding within the fabric here. Trust me, the few at the very least. All you see is something that looks inspiring and scrumptious and a cross section of folded knit fabric, and that is enough to make us think, wow, I could never possibly get my knits to look like this. And allow me to be the one to tell you, you most certainly can. It's the visual that I'm giving you. It's the idea and the vibe and the aesthetic that I'm providing here that is inspiring to you. These are not perfect knits by any means. I want to give you 2 more little tips to kind of cap this whole thing off. And these are things that I've used in the past to kind of clean up the look of something, or I've gone into a project with this in mind, knowing it's going to help clean up the look of the overall garment. And the first thing is to embrace hairy fibers. If you feel like your stitches are inconsistent and you want to knit an all over stockinette sweater, something that you've seen by My Favorite Things Knitwear or Coco Amore or Petite Knit, embrace mohair. Mohair is incredible at hiding inconsistency in stitches and lends a lot of that really professional, clean finishing to any project. And that could be mohair, it can be suri, or it could just be any kind of really hairy yarn in general. But embrace the hairy yarn, because that hairy floofiness can hide a multitude of sins within your project. And then the last little thing, if you find that the thing that's bugging you is the color of the garment, that it's just keeping it from being picture perfect and photo ready in a way that you want it to be, is to consider over dyeing it. The top that you see me wearing here is actually a heavily modified cropped short sleeve version of the Felix pullover by Amy Christophers. It originally looked like this, and that didn't really work for me because obviously you can see that there's some color pulling happening there that just wasn't what I wanted. And the overall color in general was just not, it didn't suit my skin tone. And I needed to change it because I wasn't wearing it and it just didn't have that picture perfect appeal that I wanted it to have. So I decided to do something about that and I over dyed it. And this is that same garment right here. And I wear this now. I enjoy putting it on. It looks great with my skin tone. And all I did, and I make this sound like this is the easiest thing in the world because it is not, I will tell you that, but I over dyed it. I did one little thing to give it that final touch, to make it something I would wear and to make it something that I would be proud to take a photograph of and share it with the world. Now, if you would like to see how I over dyed this and another sweater as well, head over to Patreon. There is a rather long journey video where I share that whole process with you, and that is available to anybody that visits the Patreon, whether you are an all access member or just a visiting patron. You can find that over there. It was originally here on the YouTube channel, but I moved it over to Patreon and it's accessible to everyone, but check it out. It goes into kind of how I dyed this, all of the things that went through my mind when doing it. So definitely check it out because over dyeing your hand knits is always an option. Well, there you have it, folks. A few things to keep in mind and a little bit of a discussion on how to make sure that your knits are picture perfect and photo ready, even though perfection is an absolute myth and you shouldn't have to feel the need to strive for actual perfection to achieve that really polished look. I hope you were able to take away something from today's video. And if you were, please don't forget to give the video a thumbs up. Definitely subscribe and click that bell icon so you can be notified anytime I upload new content, which is every Wednesday and every Sunday with the occasional video sprinkled in. I look forward to seeing you guys on Sunday's episode of the podcast. It's been a while and I have things to share. Can I just say free little library and a really gorgeous blue summer top. This one right, where is it? There, that I'm really excited to share with you guys. So until then, when I see you on the podcast, happy knitting, happy making, happy whatever it is that you're doing. Take care, be well, and I will see you soon. Bye.